Hello and welcome to another episode of the Express Economist. Today we'll be talking about the state of Indian economy. Our two main concerns will be growth and inflation. And to talk about this, we have Professor Pulapure Balakrishnan from Ashoka University. I'm very grateful, sir, for sparing the time to talk to viewers of Express Economist. And today we'll talk about growth and inflation. As many of our viewers might have read about, in the past couple of weeks, there's been a flurry of news. One, that India's economy has now overtaken UK's economy in overall GDP. We also had the Q1 GDP data, which was GDP for April, May, and June. And then we had issues like inflation going up again to over 7%. So that's another concern. And inflation has been a massive concern right through this calendar year and perhaps more broadly for the last 2-3 years. So today we'll discuss with Professor Balakrishnan a whole array of things. And I want to kickstart the discussion with something that sort of has brought a fair amount of pride and joy to a lot of viewers, but it's also tinged with some amount of understanding about where we are in terms of human development indices or per capita income, which was the issue about India overtaking UK as an overall economy, becoming the 5th largest economy. And these being our colonial masters, us completing 75 years of our independence. So a lot of things. Now, I wanted you to reflect on this issue. Now, how did you see, as somebody who's tracked the Indian economy such a long time, how did you sort of see this development?
A couple of things. Of course, it is not so surprising that this came about. India has been growing fairly steadily for some time. If you look at 5-year phases, the last 5 years, we've been seeing some kind of deceleration, but for a very long time, India has been going fairly steadily at rates much higher than that of the UK economy. So a time would naturally come that India would overtake the UK. Now, on the response that this has received in the public sphere, there are two responses. One has got more attention in India than the other, and both of them are important. Now, the first response is some amount of, can I say, joy and maybe a sense that, that the roles have been reversed. I mean, after all, India was a colony of Britain for almost 2 centuries in effect. And that relationship was between Britain as a whole and India as a whole. So I can understand the sense that some have about now India having taken over or overtaken Britain as the largest, as a larger of the two economies. Now, of course, you have already mentioned that. We know that this doesn't really mean very much when it comes to individual well-being. In terms of national income arithmetic, Britain's per capita income is so much higher than that of India. So it's going to take a long time for India to reach those levels, if we want to at all, and that's something I'll talk about in the course of this interaction that we have. The other is, of course, exactly what you've raised, human development levels. India, it may be useful for us to know that we are about 130 out of about 180 countries when it comes to the Human Development Index. And in fact, India's Human Development Index level has slipped a little. And sorry, all countries have slipped, but India's rank has also slipped slightly. So we should keep that in mind and not be carried away too much by this statistic. And once again, in terms of purchasing power parity, India was already the 3rd largest economy for some time now, not just this year. So all this was bound to happen. A small thing that I want to say, if I may, I just read that in the feed that came into my phone this morning about the finance minister said that all of this has been made possible by the policies of the government of the day, which I'm sorry, I must say is outrageous. In fact, she has categorically mentioned that not even the Vajpayee government could do very much about this, which is an interesting comment. And then she talked about UPA. Of course, she mercifully spoke about UPA too, I think, I don't know. But I'd just like to remind the people who may be watching us, Udit, that India's highest rates of growth were a growth run commenced with the last year of the Vajpayee government and lasted for 4 years more, which is 2003 to 2008. Even that may not be what really contributed to where we are today in terms of having overtaken Britain. But this should be seen as a very long-term process. It's by no means achieved over the last 8 years. In fact, over the last 8 years, the growth momentum has slowed from 2017-18. So some of this is highly politicized and is not worth engaging with beyond a point. I think the points that you made are very important, which are human development. I would also say per capita income, but you also said that. Now, something which has not got attention in India, interestingly enough, but has got some attention in the West, which is that India's size now, well, it has been said in so many terms, so people have spoken about India becoming the third largest economy in the world, or fifth largest, sorry, overtaking the United Kingdom. And while this is not expressed in as many terms, as many words, there is no doubt that when it comes to international relations, size does matter. I'd just like to refer to a time which is not very much in our consciousness now, but in the 1950s, Rafi Ahmed Kidwai, I think he was education minister, gives an interview to the journalist Durga Das, where he mentions very affectionately about the Prime Minister. Jawaharlal spends all his time on foreign affairs. Doesn't he realize that in the world, only economic might matters? So in a sense that India's rising GDP does give it a certain heft in international relations, without doubt. But I think that recognition should be tempered with a sense that you could have high levels of a GDP, but per capita income could be low. What's the word? Even if per capita income is high, the distribution can be so bad, but high levels of GDP are consistent with high levels of unacceptably high anyway levels of poverty. So that's what I have to say on the GDP on India overtaking UK.
Yeah, I mean, we did an analysis. I looked through the growth rates of India in UK since 1960, which was available, and I found that, and we'll perhaps pull up that graphic, since 1991, I think there was only 1 year when, in 1997, when India's growth rate was lower, inferior to UK's. So it has been, more to the point that you made, that this has not been the result of the last government or the existing government. It has taken decades for India to actually come back to this state. And if anything, the momentum has actually slowed down in the past few years.
Absolutely. And I think perspective is always useful. But nevertheless, I think this is a relatively significant event in international relations. Interestingly enough, there was a comment on it in The Guardian, a full article, in fact. And so the West seems to have recognized the importance of this for many ways, that India will now become an important player. And obviously, the democracy of the West are happy that they are one of their potential allies, if you wish, is also becoming economically an important player. This has not received as much attention in India as it has in the West, interestingly enough.
Right. The second thing I wanted to, check with you about is the Q1 GDP data. And that's obviously it's just a quarterly data, but one, I would want to ask you about, what did you make of it? Because this was the crucial quarter in which we first got hit during the COVID time. We actually contracted by almost 24-25%. And we've been trying to recover since then. And so it's a very symbolic quarter in that sense. What did you make of the GDP data? A lot of people were disappointed. A lot of people actually revised the growth for the full year downwards because they felt that the growth was not good enough, even when it grew by 13-14%.
Right. Now there are two ways to see it. I've seen kind of partisan references to it, saying that India is now, at least for that quarter, the fastest growing economy in the world, etc., etc. But the economic assessment is very simple. Even with the 20% growth in the first quarter of the last financial year and the 13.5% in this financial year in the first quarter, GDP is still less than the level of GDP is less than the trend level, i.e. had you extended the trend for the 5 years prior to the pandemic or the first 5 years of the present government, it is still below the trend level. So I think that really says everything. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and all that I can say, the forecasts seem to have been belied. But so I personally worry a little how much mileage seems to be attempted to be drawn by political players on growth in a single quarter. And it can be played both ways. Some say it's hugely disappointing, everyone are disappointing relative to forecast. Others don't refer to forecast or don't refer to the trend, but they say 13.5 is so fantastic. So yeah, I mean, we'll of course come to what the underlying aspects of it, private investment, etc.
Yeah.
But yeah, in itself, that's all I have to say. 13.5 forecast, however it is placed in relation to the forecast, it's still below the trend level of output. If you take the 5 years of the present government's time in government, in office.
That's absolutely correct. That the trend level we are quite behind,
correct,
quite below that, and it's like, I think RBI's own report on, I think, currency and finance said that we'd have. I think if we were to grow at fast pace expected that RBI expects, which seems unlikely, we'll recover the whole loss by 2032.
Oh my God!
Yeah, I think we'll pull up a chart for that also. An RBI report. That's an RBI estimation, and that also was quite unlikely. It expects India to grow at almost 7 or more than that % every year from now to 2032, which seems a little iffy right now.
Correct.
And obviously the polarized nature of our discourse, which sort of uses any particular number in such a cavalier manner. But coming to the specific, and you mentioned the bit about private investment, and this is a very important thing. I mean, very recently, the finance minister actually gave a very interesting reference about Hanuman dithering and not trusting his abilities to undertake a mission in an episode of Ramayana, and sort of using that as an analogy to say that India's private sector firms, the big firms, are not investing. And the background is that this government, especially since 2019, has been making it a central agenda that our growth has to come from private sector investments. Those investments will drive growth. Those investments will drive job creation. But despite historic corporate tax cuts, that hasn't really happened. And the desperation almost is now coming to the fore that it's not happening. So how do you sort of look at that? Why? I mean, if I was to ask one simple question, is there an answer that why Hanuman is not flying? Why? Or how do you sort of look at this situation?
In some ways, I would say that it may seem a very colorful, but it's an inappropriate analogy, right? Because Hanuman was driven by his devotion to his Lord, to Ram. The private investment, the corporate sector is not driven by devotion to anybody. I'm sorry to say, not even the country. They're driven by profits, right? Yeah. And the government certainly has, what can I say, has one failed experiment on its hands, the 2019 corporate tax cut, which leads to corporate tax rates in India being among the lowest in the world, has not led to any surge in private investment. And that's not so surprising, because I would think that what drives private investment is not so much the current profits, but expected profits. So they're not going to say no to current profits, but it's entirely likely that they would say thank you and put it in the bank, rather than invest if they don't see tremendous prospects for the growth of profits in the future, which is related to their expectation of the growth of the economy, undoubtedly, or maybe also global prospects. But I think the first instance, growth of the economy. So in some ways, there is no doubt that the policy of the Narendra Modi government, starting 2014, which tried to drive the economy through private investment. After all, you know, what is the slogan? A minimum government, maximum governance. It's also referring some way to the government's involvement in the economy, right? And actually, public expenditure in the economy till prior to pandemic had shrunk marginally, but it had shrunk in line with this philosophy. Now that experiment has failed. In 8 years, the government has not been able to raise the level of aggregate investment in the economy and private corporate investment in particular. Now, however, the government has shown itself to be entirely practical and not so ideological in the past year. I've been reading statistics, I haven't looked at it myself, that capex is, the increase in capex this year, public capital expenditure, is 65% over the last year. Yeah. Government has finally learned a lesson and realized that it has a role in maintaining aggregate demand in the economy. And it may have been completely ideological in actually keeping public spending and public investment down. Now, this is actually, it's quite, shall I say, naive to take an ideological approach to it. The whole role of public and private investment in a macroeconomic sense, rather than another sense that I'll come to in a minute, in a purely macro sense, economic sense, should be one of accounting. At a time when private investment is low, you step up public investment with a view to keeping aggregate demand and thus growth high. On the other hand, when public investment rises, you withdraw, that's all. Of course, the non-macroeconomic aspect of public investment is the supply side, to provide the infrastructure, raise productivity, etc., etc. So I just want to say, however, the government now seems to have learned a lesson. It was completely, in my view, ideological in not stepping up public expenditure during the during the pandemic. The stimulus in India, IMF shows, till 2021, now all this is happening in 2022, the capex increase, etc. Till 2021, the stimulus in India was 3.3% of GDP. It was 25% in the United States. Now, the United States may have overdone it in terms of now the consequences for inflation, but please remember also unemployment in the United States is at a 50-year low. 50, not 5, 10, or a couple of quarters. It's at a 50-year low. So I just want to say that, of course, you may not want to go anywhere close to 25, but the refusal to stimulate the economy during the pandemic, I think, is purely ideological. And a lot of the votaries of the government say, look, we did the right thing. India has lower inflation in the West. That's right. But how much lower? India is 7%. America is 8-point-something%. Is that much lower? The increase in output in the United States between 2019 and 2021 is much greater than the increase in output, if at all, in India. Well, there is now 4%, 3.8%. In the United States, much higher. So talking about public investment and private investment, it's a government has mostly, till it really learned a lesson, taken a very ideological approach to this. And for a nationalist government, I might say, it's really followed the principles or dicta, if that's the right word, of the Washington Consensus of the 1990s, which is low government intervention, aim for low inflation, that will be good enough. And in all fairness, till recently, inflation has been low, and the Modi government has been able to bring it down a little bit, but it has done nothing for investment in general and corporate investment, which suggests that at the end of the day, you can't get away from the fact, in this case, Hanuman is not flying because he's not convinced that the government has a great economic plan. So Hanuman is being perfectly rational in staying put. So
very, very well put. And also the incentives matter, and what the private sector looks at, that matters.
Absolutely, absolutely.
A lot of and that goes back, and these are all things are linked. The stimulus that the government could have done,
correct,
might be argued on one platform as a master stroke, but
correct.
That is also the reason why future incomes are not there. And
to some extent, yes, to some extent, maybe you may have had slightly higher inflation, I don't know. Yeah. But the contraction, it seems to me, would have been less.
Yeah.
That comes across clear, sorry to cut you, that comes across clearly. It's in my recent book, the data from the IMF comes across clearly when you compare India with the BRICS and the US.
Yeah. And, the related point was that often it doesn't show up, the distress doesn't show up even in unemployment numbers of what the money that could have been spent to bring people or allow them to cope with the kind of disruption that COVID brought about.
Correct.
It doesn't show up in official numbers.
Nobody says that it should be permanent. Temporarily during that period.
Yeah. And you mentioned inflation, and this is a good time to sort of pivot to the other big concern, because the growth in inflation it's a task, that balancing act that fiscal policymakers and monetary policymakers have to sort of do all the time. But in India, especially since the start of 2022, there's been no doubt that inflation has been outside RBI's comfort zone. And after initial notions that maybe it's a passing phase, now even the RBI doesn't pretend to do that. They openly admit that inflation in the current financial year will stay outside 6%, which is the highest that they should ideally allow. So I wanted to ask you about your reflections on RBI's performance in controlling inflation, or India's performance in controlling inflation. How do you sort of rate that? And is there some fundamental flaw in we are going about it?
No, this is really, you've invited me or set me off on this board. This is really going to be a reflection without too much emphasis in the current, but I'll come back to that in the end. Now, starting 1991, and interestingly enough, 2014, while Mr. Arun Jaitley was the finance minister of India, there's been a tremendous effort by the Indian government, governments of different hues, to copy the architecture, so to speak, of Western economies, of the Western democracies, which are the most impressive economies in the world anyway, I mean, other than China. But we're closer to the West because we're democratic. China can do things which we can't do because it's authoritarian. Part of this architecture was inflation targeting, which gives complete control of inflation to the Reserve Bank of India, including within which lies the suggestion that the Reserve Bank can control inflation if it is sufficiently motivated. Now, that presumption has been completely shattered over the, not just over the past 6 to 7 months, as you said, starting the beginning of the year when the inflation has been above target, the RBI target. But I read that the inflation rate has been above the target of 4% for 35 consecutive months. 35 consecutive months. And now the governor of the Reserve Bank has said it's in an interview that he's given online, will take 24 months for inflation to come to 4%, not less than 6%, which means for 5 years, 60 months, the inflation rate has been above the target. This should really make us ask questions about what is the meaning of inflation targeting with specific targets, etc. There are two issues here. One is that should you have such specific targets? For the simple reason, if you have specific targets and you're continuously falling behind, is very demoralizing. And with the agreement signed by the Government of India and the Reserve Bank of India, inflation control is the principal objective of monetary policy. Principle. So the monetary policy is failing in kind of the principal task that has been assigned to it. Now, that's one thing. The other thing is about what this inflation in India reflects. Now, whether you look at very long periods, 40, 50 years using statistical analysis, and I and a co-author of mine by the name of N.M. Parameshwaran of the Center for Development Studies at Trivandrum have done quite a lot of empirical work on this. And undoubtedly, what is driving inflation is the relative price of food, i.e. price of food in relation to the general price level or other goods in the economy. Interestingly enough, in statistical work, the impact of the relative price of food on inflation in India is much higher than that of oil. Much higher, not just higher, but much higher. So in a sense, also it's very wrong, I think, to rush to the analysis that inflation in India is due to the Ukraine war. It is not. Inflation was, as you yourself said, has been above 6% from January. The Ukraine war kicks in late Feb, early March, and has been above 4% for a long time. And all of this is tracked fairly well by the price of food in India. Now, not only can monetary policy do very little about it, but in an interesting speech that the finance minister gave at ICRIER about 10 days ago, I don't know if you've noticed it, at the think tank in Delhi, she said monetary policy cannot be left to, inflation cannot be left to monetary policy, fiscal policy also should play a role. And she spoke a little bit about export bans and tariff duties and all that, duties and imports, and that's correct. But though that's really tinkering with the system, tinkering with inflation or the drivers of inflation. Fiscal policy could have a role in the United States kind of economy where the inflation can be related quite closely to the stimulus and the very high rate of growth of wages. In India, you don't have very high rate of growth of wages of late. In fact, some estimates that I've seen as the real wage has declined in the past year. So clearly it's not wage growth that is driving inflation, but once again, the price of food. Now, the price of food cannot be controlled by macroeconomic policy. We just have to go back to the drawing board and look at agriculture. And I just want to say two things here and stop. One is that it is noticeable that the Modi government has not really given much attention to the agriculture sector in the 8 years it has been in power. It has focused, interestingly enough, on Make in India, which is entirely on industry and trying to attract foreign direct investment, etc. It has not given any attention to agriculture. But the other thing that I wish to say is that I think state governments probably have a huge role to play because, after all, agricultural production is happening at the level of the state. So it's not clear to me that inflation can be controlled very easily from the center in any case, because now a lot of the inflation has also been driven by price of vegetables, milk and associated protein, and interestingly enough, not very much by edible oils. So again, the war in Ukraine story is actually somehow diverting our attention. We should just recognize there is an underlying inflation in India driven by the price of agricultural goods in relation to the other goods in the economy. This does not mean that the inflation rate may not stop. It may slowly die down in India. Why? Partly also in periods of high unemployment, worker bargaining power is less. So even if prices rise, they're not going to be able to bid up wages. If wages don't increase very much, then in the next round, prices will not rise by as much, and the whole process will die down by itself, which will have nothing to do with the Reserve Bank of India, by the way. It is just the inflation process as a certain kind of dynamic, and that dynamic will be to inflation to taper off that is possible.
So, I mean, this is fantastic.
Sorry to cut you. So I'm just trying to say, but especially, I'm surprised it didn't seem to strike a chord in you, but please read the finance minister's comments at the ICRIER conference, in case you haven't seen it as yet. And I would just say, this seems to be the perfect time for me, if you ask me, to have a social audit of what the Reserve Bank in India does. What should be its tasks? What can it do? What can it not do? And I think this is just the time to do that. Yeah.
I would like to end the show by asking you two questions. One is your outlook on growth, and the other is your outlook on inflation. Inflation, I'm asking again because we are hearing all the time that the RBI is spending a lot of forex in trying to contain rupee, keep it below the 80 mark. A lot of people are arguing that, it should not spend so much forex to keep it like that. And that if you were to allow rupee to fall further, say go to 82, 85, whatever over time, it will actually mean that you'll import more inflation because everything is costlier in terms of imports. So what's the outlook that you have? And I'm not asking you for a month or two or whatever. I'm asking you more broadly speaking on both growth and inflation. How do you see things panning out?
Let me say something first, very briefly, on this point about the exchange rate. You're absolutely right, and people are correct in saying what they are about the consequence of the depreciation of the rupee on inflation. But I just want to say that intervening in the foreign exchange market, either directly or via higher interest rates to prevent the depreciation of the rupee, can only prevent further worsening of inflation. That by itself does not take care of the drivers of inflation. We're back to food and possibly imported oil prices. And the second round affects wage bargaining, etc. So that's the first point. On inflation, as I said, I think it'll probably peter out to some extent, partly because unemployment is high. Workers have a less bargaining power now to make up for the reduction in their real wage, and the process will probably taper down, is my sense. But as I said, I don't think it has much to do with the Reserve Bank of India. I just want to make a small point, if I may, at the cost of seeing to flog my own research on public television, but I must say that I really believe that this constant reference to the anchoring of expectations by central banks, whether in the West or India, have published research in most recent issue of the Indian Economic Review, which comes out from the Delhi School of Economics, which shows that expectations is not a determinant of inflation in India. And in some of the my articles which you've read, or you say you read, I tell you why the public is not convinced by this argument, I tell my reader why. So that's about inflation. The inflation outlook can probably taper off, but I'm not sure how much it's going to do with the RBI. Because also remember, October, November is when the harvest comes in and all the rest of it. So we'll probably slowly taper off. The inflation will probably taper off. Growth, I'm not overly optimistic in the sense this is wild projections. I mean, in 1914, Mr. Modi mentioned 5 trillion by 2025. Now, that is just opened up a Pandora's box. We have somebody actually forecasting for 2047, and I thought that Mr. Piyush Goyal was reported to have mentioned that we'll have an economy of 30 trillion. I mean, I can't believe my eyes. Now, all this is very simple-minded projection, which are using what economists call linear models, etc. To conclude, first about the feasibility. With private investment not showing any sign of revival, in general, I am skeptical about very high rates of growth in the near future. Even though some very partisan economists have referred to 13.5 in the last quarter and all the rest of it, even though it's well before trend, sorry, well below trend. So I'm a bit skeptical of that. The other and the more important point that I want to say, and I want to conclude with that, I mean, we've all watched scenes from Bengaluru, right? I mean, so what is this growth? What is the point of having 30 trillion and once again you come down from your penthouse and watch your Lamborghini bumper up with water, and that's for the rich, and the condition of the poor and the terrible conditions that they have to live with, even here in Delhi. Garbage mountains, I mean, electricity failure. That's the kind of thing that shocks me. Over the year, I'm very privileged to live in 3 parts of the country, at least 2 parts of the country, Kerala and Haryana, and I live in rural parts of these 2 states. Not even, and 10 days ago, I was in Bengaluru. But especially about Kerala and Haryana, I'm shocked at the way the power is switching. If we cannot generate electricity steadily, power steadily without fluctuation, I mean, just what are we playing at? I mean, so even if we have 30 trillion, which probably will become if we have an exploding IT sector or something, or I don't know, maybe, I don't think it's going to happen, but maybe. Also because, by the way, exports are also, slightly, under question now because the global economy is going to slow for some time. But even if that happens, I'm not sure they'll really erase the conditions of life that we have in India, which require an altogether different imagination from the political class and Indian democracy.
Right. Thanks a lot, sir. That was a wide-ranging discussion, and I'm very grateful that you explained and gave us so much food for thought. I hope viewers would have understood a bit about what is the way our growth is panning out and what are the constraints to our growth. When the finance minister says that why aren't bigger companies investing, it's not just a question of one particular element. It is telling you a story about India's economy, about the sort of the overall health of India's demand, people's demand, and also some fantastic points about inflation. What can RBI do, what it has not been possibly, what it can't do and has been trying to do, and what are the factors that actually lead to inflation. So there's much to chew on this, and for many of our viewers who might be interested in wanting to read Professor Balakrishnan more, I would just like to recommend a book he has just recently published. It's India's Economy from Nehru to Modi, A Brief History. It's a fantastic refresher course for anybody who wants to sort of look back and see and understand about the India's economy. And so very grateful, sir, for sparing so generously of your time and your insights with the Express Economist. Thanks for being on.
Thank you very much, Udit, you and your colleagues.
Thank you. And if you guys like the show, please press like and subscribe. We'll be back next week. Thank you.